The final descent into the canyon took nearly 8 hours. The coordinates provided by Caleb led the search and recovery team to a narrow basin tucked deep inside a restricted northern zone of Zion that was almost impossible to reach without technical gear. The route included vertical drops, loose shale fields, and several tight passes that had to be widened manually. The location had no trail markers and was far beyond any ranger patrol route. The area's isolation explained why no hikers had stumbled upon it during the previous years. As the team approached the base of the canyon, the wind shifted suddenly, bringing with it the faint scent of decay. At the edge of a dry wash beneath an overhang of eroded sandstone, they saw a faint shape covered in debris. The site had been carefully concealed with branches, stones, and loose soil, but time and weather had stripped away much of the camouflage. When the crew reached the scene, they uncovered 2 sets of skeletal remains. One was small, curled inward arms crossed over the ribs, the skull tilted against the larger set. The other lay slightly bent, with rope still knotted around the ankles and wrists. The position of the bodies suggested an embrace frozen by time. The recovery team paused as they realized who they had found. The smaller frame matched Riley's dimensions, while the larger frame bore remnants of a medical alert tag on a cracked wrist bone. Forensic identification would follow later, but everyone present knew this was Janine and Riley Monroe. Beside them, wedged into a crevice in the wall, was a tattered cloth pouch. Inside was a sandwich bag sealed with tape, and still mostly intact. Within the bag was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. Written in neat but shaky handwriting were the final words of a child who had watched everything fall apart. The note read, "If he ever comes back, tell him I forgave him anyway." That single sentence was enough to silence the canyon. Everyone who read it felt the weight of it pressing into their chest. Riley had written those words not knowing whether anyone would ever read them. She had written them in darkness after losing her mother after being left alone. But her message did not speak of hate. It spoke of something purer. It spoke of forgiveness in the face of betrayal. As the remains were carefully lifted and preserved, the emotional toll rippled through every member of the team. These were no longer just names on a missing persons file. They were a mother and daughter who had clung to each other in their final moments. They were 2 people who had been betrayed by someone they trusted and abandoned in silence. The physical evidence confirmed the rest. There were signs of restraint on both skeletons. The location matched Caleb's confession in full detail. DNA would later verify their identities. The area was permanently marked by the Park Service as a protected memorial site. No trail would be built to it. No visitor would casually wander into it. It would be preserved exactly as it was found, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been learned. Patrick Monroe's fate remained partially unknown. Caleb's confession indicated that Patrick had planned to return, but never did. Months later, a hiker in a separate section of the park found a partial skeleton beneath a rock slide. Dental records confirmed it was Patrick. The forensic report suggested he had fallen or been pushed, possibly during a confrontation or in a moment of panic. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull. Whether the fall was accidental or intentional would never be known, but the discovery offered some form of closure. The man who had initiated the chain of events, who had led his family into the wilderness under false promises, had not escaped the consequences. In the end, the canyon had taken all of them, not by nature's cruelty, but by human choice. The silence of that place became its final testimony. The Monroe's story sparked a national review of backcountry permit systems and triggered sweeping reforms in missing persons protocols across national parks. Rangers received new equipment, access gate policies were overhauled, and cross-agency databases were updated to include behavioral red flags. A foundation was established in Janine and Riley's names, offering support for families at risk of domestic control and coercive behavior. The memorial at Kolob Viewpoint became a place of quiet reflection, with visitors often leaving paper cranes and handwritten notes. Riley's final words were etched into a stone beneath the overlook, a permanent reminder that even in moments of fear and pain, compassion can still survive. The final report on the Monroe case concluded with a paragraph that was read aloud at the memorial dedication. It stated that this was not the story of a disappearance. It was the story of the mother who tried to protect her child, a child who tried to protect her mother, and a man whose fears overtook his love. It was a story of silence that was broken by one voice, Riley's voice. In her last act, she chose not bitterness but grace. That choice became her legacy. Not because it undid what had happened, but because it reminded everyone of what was still possible. Healing, accountability, change. The search for the Monroe family ended with answers, but their message continued far beyond the canyon walls. It echoed in classrooms and courtrooms, in training seminars, and in the hearts of those who had followed every step. Riley's message had survived 7 years of weather and wind. It had survived betrayal and sorrow. And in the end, it had changed the way people looked at silence. It had taught them to listen. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more true story reconstructions. Share your thoughts about the case in the comments, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. 2 days after the truck was discovered, the Barlows story took an even stranger turn. That morning, a postal carrier on her usual route in Bozeman noticed movement near the porch of the Barlow home. She assumed someone from the family had returned and made her way up the front steps. What she saw instead was their golden retriever Bailey, curled up near the welcome mat. The dog was caked in dirt and visibly thinner than when she had last been seen. Her eyes were red from exhaustion, her legs trembling as she stood. Animal control was called and examined Bailey closely. What puzzled them most was the absence of any major wounds. No signs of animal attack, broken bones, or torn pads on her paws. Her body showed only the wear of a long journey. The fact that she had returned over 150 miles from where the family had last been headed raised immediate questions. No one had reported picking up a stray dog. No microchip scanner had flagged her in another county. It appeared she had made her way back entirely on her own. The media picked up the story, but the dog had no answers to give. While volunteers and police tried to understand Bailey's return, another discovery was made that seemed almost deliberately staged. Forest Service workers tasked with clearing brush after a minor storm were working along a gravel service road 20 miles from the nearest main highway. The sound of an engine caught their attention. At first they thought another crew had arrived, but the engine tone was off. As they came around the bend, they found the Barlow's blue Chevy Silverado sitting half-sunken in a ditch. The vehicle was running. The headlights were dim from battery drain. The engine idled as though it had been left on for hours. The driver's side door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside the truck, Ruth's purse and Gary's wallet sat untouched. Nothing had been taken. The cash remained in the wallet. Ruth's phone was still inside her purse, though it had long since died. There were no coffee cups, no wrappers, no gear in the back seat. Just silence. The scene felt frozen, as though someone had stepped out for a moment and never returned. The location of the truck made the discovery even more unsettling. It was found along a service road that had not been used since early summer. The gravel had grown thick with weeds, and recent rains had made the path nearly impassable. There were no tire tracks leading into the ditch, no mud trails, no broken branches that might suggest a struggle. The truck appeared to have simply arrived there, parked itself, and waited. Investigators scoured the surrounding woods for any indication that someone had left on foot. They found no footprints, no clothing, no gear left behind. It was as if the truck and its contents had been airlifted in. One of the rangers said it looked like someone had been trying to hide the truck but got interrupted midway through. Another swore he could hear a faint echo when he approached the tree line, like someone breathing just out of sight. News of the truck's condition spread quickly, and search efforts were expanded. Helicopters were flown over the area with infrared sensors. Search dogs were brought in from Missoula and Great Falls. Volunteers from surrounding counties joined the effort. They scoured riverbanks, cleared thickets, and swept through old trails that had not been walked in decades. But they found nothing. Not a thread of clothing, not a torn map, not even a bottle cap. All signs of the Barlows had vanished. The focus shifted to examining the truck more closely. Mechanics from the county office were brought in to analyze the engine's behavior. They estimated the vehicle had been running for close to 30 hours before it was found. But no one could explain how the battery had not died or why no wildlife had disturbed the scene. Forest Service workers said even bears tend to explore vehicles if they smell food. This truck had remained perfectly untouched. It was too quiet, too still. As more people shared memories of the Barlows' last day in town, one story stood out. A neighbor recalled watching the truck leave early in the morning. She remembered Ruth sitting in the passenger seat and Gary behind the wheel. But she also noticed something odd. Someone else had been in the back seat. The figure had long, dark hair and sat low as if slouched intentionally. The neighbor assumed it was one of Caleb's friends, but when asked again later, she said the figure did not look like a teenager. It looked like a man in his 30s. No friends or relatives were known to have joined the family. No extra toothbrush was found in the home. No fourth set of prints was discovered in the truck. The idea that someone else had been with them, possibly uninvited or unannounced, added a sinister tone to what had already become a haunting story. The presence of a fourth person reshaped the timeline. And it turned a baffling disappearance into something far more ominous. While search teams continued combing through dense forest near where the truck had been found, detectives turned their attention back to Bozeman, hoping that something in the family's daily routine might offer a lead. They started with Ruth, whose role at the church had placed her at the center of a tight-knit community. Several friends told investigators that Ruth had seemed anxious in the weeks leading up to the trip. She had been more forgetful than usual and had canceled 2 Wednesday evening choir rehearsals without explanation. One of her close friends, Marlene Cross, said Ruth confided in her about a growing feeling that something was wrong at home. She never gave specifics, but hinted that Gary had become secretive. Ruth's sister later provided a more startling piece of information. On the day before they left, Ruth had quietly withdrawn $3,000 in cash from a joint bank account the family rarely used. She had not told Gary. The footage from the bank showed Ruth looking over her shoulder several times as she waited in line. Her hand trembled slightly as she handed over her ID. The teller remembered her silence. It looked like fear had taken root. At the same time, Caleb's school folders and notebooks were being reviewed by investigators who were looking for anything that could point to the boy's state of mind. One item stood out immediately. In the margins of his science binder, just beneath a lesson on photosynthesis, were several hand-scrawled notes. Written in pencil, and with uneven pressure, they read like fragments of a larger thought. One note said the phone had rung 3 times, with no one on the other end. Another read that Dad said it was the station calling again, but Caleb did not believe him. These notes were dated a week before the trip. The handwriting started neat, but trailed off near the end of the page. A child psychologist later reviewed the notes and said they reflected growing anxiety. Caleb had been quiet in class, but not withdrawn, curious but guarded. His teachers remembered him as polite, but often distracted in the weeks before the family disappeared. When asked if he had said anything strange, his science teacher recalled Caleb once asking whether you could still hear people talking after they left a room. Police asked the phone company for records of any unusual calls to the Barlow residence. What they found added to the mystery. Between October 3rd and October 12th, the family received 6 calls that lasted less than 5 seconds each. All came from unlisted numbers, and none were traced to a known source. The calls were always made between midnight and 4 in the morning. When investigators attempted to trace them, they reached a dead end. One officer described the pattern as deliberate. Someone had wanted to make contact without leaving a trace. When Ruth's sister was told about the calls, she shook her head slowly and whispered that Ruth had mentioned hearing noises at night. She thought it had been the house settling or the dog reacting to shadows. But now it seemed possible that Ruth had sensed something was beginning to unravel. Something had invaded the quiet rhythm of their home life, and neither parent had spoken about it openly. The investigation expanded to include Gary's place of work. At the Bozeman Fire and EMS station, his colleagues described him as reliable and professional. but one coworker noted that Gary had recently begun asking strange questions about old fire zones in the Bitterroot Mountains. He had requested a set of decommissioned contour maps from the early 1980s, claiming he was planning a hike with his son. No one found this unusual at the time. But in light of the family's disappearance, those maps took on new significance. Rangers confirmed that some of those areas were now closed off due to erosion and fire damage. Gary had also placed a call to a retired firefighter named Walter Briggs, who had worked on the original 1982 containment lines. Walter said Gary had asked him about cabins near Trapper Ridge. Walter did not recall specifics, but remembered telling Gary that those sites had been removed from the public database. Gary thanked him and never followed up. As the search efforts in the forest began to stall, investigators returned to the Barlows' home to examine their belongings once again. This time they focused on what was missing, rather than what remained. Ruth's jewelry box was still full. Caleb's duffel bag was packed, but left on his bedroom floor. There were no signs of a rushed departure. The refrigerator had been cleaned out, and the trash had been taken out the night before they left. This gave the impression of an intentional trip, not a frantic escape. But nothing about the story felt intentional anymore. Detectives considered the possibility that someone had pressured Ruth into leaving, or that Gary had been leading the family toward something he had not fully explained. They even explored whether the family might have discovered something in the forest that made them flee their original route. But without evidence or witnesses, the theory remained speculation. What they knew was that a woman had quietly taken out cash, a boy had scribbled nervous thoughts in the margins of his schoolwork, and a man had been looking for maps that no one else cared about anymore. The deeper the investigators looked into the Barlows' final hours, the more disjointed the picture became. One of the last verified stops the family made was at a gas station on the edge of Wisdom, Montana, a tiny roadside outpost with a single pump and a dimly lit shop that sold cold sandwiches and fishing lures. The station attendant on duty that morning was a man named Terry Mullins, who had worked that job for nearly a decade. When interviewed, Terry said Gary Barlow had pulled up just before sunrise and filled the tank without saying a word. He remembered the man's eyes. They looked empty, as if something was weighing on him so heavily it had pulled all the life out of his face. Ruth stayed in the truck, staring straight ahead. Terry noticed she kept her hands in her lap the entire time and never moved. Caleb sat in the back seat, but his face was turned toward the window. After paying in cash, Gary accidentally left behind a worn Montana highway atlas. It had several red circles drawn around remote forest areas that did not appear connected to any public trail system. That forgotten map became the next breadcrumb. The atlas found at the gas station was turned over to the sheriff's office. The circles drawn in red ink focused on a cluster of locations just west of Trapper Ridge. These spots had no labels and did not appear on any current trail maps. The ink had bled slightly through the paper, which meant the marks were made recently. One of the circled spots corresponded with a fire zone from 1982 that had been declared off-limits after a series of rock slides rendered the area unstable. The others were simply blank spaces surrounded by contour lines. A Forest Service veteran brought in to consult said the circled areas had once included old logging trails that were officially removed from maps in the late 80s. The fact that Gary had marked these areas without telling anyone disturbed investigators. It suggested he had been planning something privately. What added more confusion was that he had not packed any of his usual hiking gear. His boots and compass remained at home. He had brought nothing that suggested he wanted to explore. Yet the map said otherwise. 9 miles from the area marked in the atlas, a ranger named Dennis Carlson was working an overnight shift at a weather monitoring station. The station sat on a ridge that offered a wide view of the valley below. On the night of October 15th, he recorded in the station log that he heard voices coming from the woods just after midnight. He described them as heated. A woman's voice shouted the words, "You lied," several times. A second voice, softer and younger, sounded like it was crying. The sound lasted no more than 2 minutes, and then stopped completely. Dennis stepped outside with a flashlight, but saw no one. He called over the radio to report it, but the log only notes the time and the direction from which the sound came. Later, when he heard about the Barlow case, he believed without question that it had been Ruth and Caleb. The direction matched the path from which their vehicle had been found days later. There were no registered campers or hikers in that area. It had been marked as restricted for years. Investigators went back to review emergency call logs from that night, hoping that perhaps Ruth or Caleb had tried to reach someone. No calls were made from their phones. Ruth's cell phone had been powered down by the time the voices were heard. The sheriff's office did receive one anonymous call that night, just before 1 in the morning. A female voice whispered something that could not be understood, followed by the sound of the line going dead. The call came from a payphone outside a diner in Salmon, Idaho, over 70 miles from the area where the truck was found. The voice was too distorted to confirm, as Ruth's and the surveillance camera at the diner was broken. A deputy drove out to the location, but no one was there. The booth sat empty. This piece of the timeline added yet another crack to the already splintered case. Either someone in the family had managed to travel that distance, or someone else entirely had been trying to signal for help. A local volunteer joined the search effort a few days after the voices were heard. His name was Shane Goddard, a former tracker with experience navigating backcountry terrain. He reported something he found strange. While hiking near an old service trail, he came across an empty plastic water bottle balanced carefully on a moss-covered rock. It looked recently placed. There was no dust on it, no condensation inside, and no signs of animal disturbance. Shane said it was not the kind of thing a careless hiker would leave behind. The placement seemed intentional. Nearby, he also found a plastic spoon partially buried in pine needles. These small discoveries were logged and photographed, but no fingerprints could be pulled from them. Investigators wondered if someone had been trying to leave a trail, something subtle that would not be obvious to everyone, but might speak to someone familiar with survival skills. It became a quiet theory among the team that Caleb had been trying to help them find their way. As the investigation dragged into its 3rd week, frustrations grew among the search crews and law enforcement. The story had gained traction across the state and was beginning to attract national attention. Volunteers from outside Montana began arriving with their own theories and equipment, offering to help comb through the vast stretch of forest. Despite the increased manpower, the search yielded no meaningful results. Sheriff's deputies returned to the nearest ranger outpost near Trapper Ridge, hoping to find overlooked details or forgotten logs that might shed light on the Barlows' last known location. The ranger station itself was modest, built from heavy timber. Decades earlier, its walls lined with laminated trail maps and yellowing fire charts. While combing through the logbooks and posted maps, one officer noticed that 3 fire contour maps had been torn from the wall. These particular maps covered sections of the forest marked as decommissioned following a series of landslides in 1982. None of the rangers had removed them, and there was no official record of updates. It was unclear who had taken them or why, but the missing maps aligned almost exactly with the red circles in the atlas Gary had left behind at the gas station. Investigators now believed someone had deliberately removed information related to a specific area of the forest. Whether Gary had done it himself or someone else had tried to erase paths that no longer appeared on public maps remained uncertain. What became even more puzzling was the sudden appearance of Caleb's school ID card in an entirely different state. In May of 2001, 3 years after the disappearance, an envelope arrived at the Pocatello Police Department in Idaho. It was plain with no return address and postmarked from Salmon, a small mountain town roughly 40 miles from the fire zone. Inside was Caleb's student ID from Hyalite Middle School. There was no note, no fingerprints, and no trace of DNA on the envelope. The card had not been damaged or weathered. It looked as if someone had kept it stored away and then decided to send it anonymously. Detectives followed up with postal staff and surveillance from the Salmon post office, but no leads emerged. Whoever had mailed the card had slipped in and out without being seen. The discovery of the ID led law enforcement to question whether Caleb might still be alive, or if someone had taken the card from him as a keepsake or message. The The possibility that he had survived and was trying to reach out gave Ruth's sister a glimmer of hope, though she kept it private. Law enforcement released a statement requesting that anyone who had seen the Barlows or Caleb come forward, emphasizing that any detail, no matter how small, could be valuable. Tips poured in for several weeks, including supposed sightings of a boy resembling Caleb at rest stops and bus terminals, but none could be confirmed. Each false lead drained resources and wore down the morale of the team. At the same time, the Barlows' home in Bozeman remained untouched, as if frozen in time. The mailbox continued to gather flyers and local bulletins. The porch light remained on every night. Neighbors still passed by and slowed their steps at the edge of the driveway, hoping for something to change. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded to local pawn shops and secondhand stores, hoping someone might have sold or traded any of the Barlows' belongings. In a Missoula pawn shop in late 2006, a silver bracelet was brought in for appraisal. It bore the initials RB etched into the underside and matched the description of one Ruth had worn regularly. The bracelet showed minimal wear, but had traces of sap embedded in the inner grooves, as if it had been removed while near or inside a pinewood structure. The man who brought it in provided a name and ID, but both turned out to be false. Surveillance footage showed him wearing a long coat and baseball cap pulled low. He left the shop quickly after being told the item needed to be held for verification. Detectives believed it was either stolen from the site or offered by someone who had come into contact with the Barlows after they disappeared. The fact that it had resurfaced so far from Bozeman only deepened the mystery. That same week, teenagers exploring an abandoned fishing shack near Painted Rock Lake found something unexpected wedged under the rotting floorboards. It was a Polaroid photo curled from moisture but still legible. The picture showed Gary Barlow standing beside another man who did not match any known relative or coworker. Both men appeared solemn. Behind them stood a weathered cabin that did not appear on any official Forest Service maps. The cabin had a sagging roof, narrow windows, and a dark patch on one side that looked like it had been scorched by fire long ago. Investigators who examined the photo said Gary appeared thinner than in his earlier family photos. The look on his face was not one of fear, but of something heavier, like guilt or resignation. The identity of the second man in the photo was never confirmed, but the image provided the first visual evidence that Gary had reached some structure not listed in public records. That discovery would prompt a new search area to be added to the map, one that led deeper into a part of the forest most had forgotten. After the photograph surfaced in the old fishing shack, authorities focused their attention on tracking down the unknown man seen beside Gary. The facial features were partially obscured by shadow, but his frame and posture were clear enough to suggest he was younger than Gary by at least 10 years. The photo showed no visible timestamp, but the condition of the paper and the fading at the corners suggested it had been taken within the past 5 years. Investigators sent the image to facial recognition labs and distributed it among local and state agencies, hoping someone might come forward with a name. Meanwhile, officers returned to the area near Painted Rock Lake, determined to locate the unmarked cabin captured in the background. Satellite imaging and aerial surveillance did not reveal any structure matching the one in the photo. The trees had grown dense in that region, and many believed the cabin was either intentionally built off the grid or long since abandoned. Searchers on foot tried to retrace the photograph's angle, studying ridgelines and timber layouts, but the search came up empty. Still, the discovery suggested Gary had reached a destination he had not spoken about to anyone. At the same time, the photo reignited attention on the missing bracelet, which had been verified by Ruth's sister as belonging to her. The pawnshop owner in Missoula provided the security footage showing the man who brought it in. His appearance was similar to the unknown man in the photo. Authorities began to suspect he may have had direct contact with the Barlows, perhaps even having stayed with them. The man's mannerisms on the footage appeared cautious, his body language tense. He kept his face angled downward and never removed his sunglasses. Although no charges were filed, a sketch artist was brought in to create a composite from the video, and the image was distributed to surrounding towns and cities. Still, no one recognized him. Ruth's bracelet found, with traces of sap and dirt, now linked the forest to the pawn shop and the shack, to a stranger whose purpose remained unclear. Each new item seemed to tighten the web, and yet no central answer emerged. The evidence built like a puzzle scattered on the floor, and investigators could not yet see the final image. As word of the case continued to spread, it reached a small group of wilderness guides operating along the Salmon River Trail. One guide named Linda Harrell stepped forward with a recollection from the summer of 1999. She described a young boy who had approached her as she was packing her gear near the edge of the river. He looked dirty, but unharmed, and wore a flannel shirt that seemed too large for his frame. The boy asked her about a trail that led back to the old burned ridge using that exact phrase. Linda had never heard anyone refer to a fire zone that way, but she assumed he meant one of the trails that had been closed since the late 80s. She explained there was no safe access anymore. The boy nodded and disappeared into the trees without giving a name. At the time, she did not think to report the encounter. But after seeing Caleb's face on the news years later, she became convinced the boy had been him. The tone in his voice stayed with her. He had not sounded lost. He had sounded like someone searching for a way back. Around that same time, another report surfaced from a solo hiker named Ellie Zimmerman, who had been trekking the Devil's Backbone route in 2003. Ellie described crossing paths with a woman in ragged outdoor gear who looked weathered but alert. The woman asked about ranger stations in the area, her speech slow and deliberate. Ellie found her behavior strange, especially when the woman kept glancing toward the woods as if expecting someone to appear. Ellie offered her water, but the woman declined. When Ellie looked away briefly to adjust her pack, the woman was gone. Later, while reading about the Barlow case, Ellie became convinced that the woman had been Ruth. Investigators interviewed Ellie thoroughly and asked her to review older family photos of Ruth. She pointed to 2 images and said she was certain of the resemblance. This new encounter added weight to the theory that at least 2 members of the Barlow family may have survived for years living in secrecy or isolation. But the question remained, why? If they were alive and capable of returning, what had kept them away for so long? The search team returned to the area behind Devil's Backbone and the Salmon River region using updated topographic scans and ground-level surveys to look for signs of movement or temporary shelter. In one ravine beneath a thick blanket of moss and leaves, they uncovered fragments of a nylon tarp and rusted tin cans. A small fire pit, long cold, had been dug into the soil and then partially covered with flat stones. No DNA was found, but the setup suggested someone had camped there long-term and left with care. There were no footprints or trash. Everything had been cleaned or buried. Searchers marked the site and expanded the radius, but nothing more was found. Still, the pattern was beginning to emerge. Traces of movement in forgotten places, objects surfacing far from where they should be, and strangers appearing with quiet knowledge. The truth was drawing closer, but no one could yet say who had chosen to disappear and who might have been forced to. The summer of 2009 brought one of the driest fire seasons Montana had seen in years. Lightning storms swept across the upper ranges of the Bitterroot Mountains, sparking blazes that quickly consumed sections of dried forest that had not burned in decades. One of those fires moved toward Trapper Peak and eventually reached areas that had been untouched since the early 1980s. Fire crews were dispatched from across the region, and while digging containment lines near an overgrown ravine, they discovered something strange. Beneath a collapsed tree and layers of scorched brush, a firefighter noticed a hollow sound as his shovel struck wood. The crew carefully uncovered what appeared to be a handmade structure partially buried and concealed with camouflaged netting and logs. The shelter was barely large enough for 2 people, built from salvaged boards and sealed with tarps that had held through multiple seasons. Inside were rows of canned goods labeled with expiration dates from the mid-90s, and 2 sleeping rolls still laid out as if someone had just stepped outside. One of the firefighters lifted a loose floorboard and found a water-damaged photograph wedged underneath. It was the Barlow family standing in front of what appeared to be the same hidden cabin from the Polaroid. The discovery of the shelter sent a wave of urgency through the investigation. The location was not far from the red-marked spots in Gary's highway atlas and directly bordered a zone removed from forest maps after the fire in 1982. The fire crew halted work, and law enforcement quickly secured the site. Inside a sealed plastic bag tucked in a corner, searchers found several notebooks, all filled with dated entries. The handwriting matched Gary's from older work forms. Most entries were mundane, listing temperature readings and trail conditions, but others hinted at tension. One note read that Ruth had not spoken in 2 days and that Caleb refused to eat. Another entry mentioned hearing voices echoing through the trees, though the context made it clear Gary was not describing hallucinations, but rather his own fear of being discovered. He wrote about covering their tracks and regretting his decision to come so far. There was no mention of who else might have been with them. The final dated entry simply said the air is thick tonight, and we are tired of hiding. After that, the pages were blank. Nearby, within 100 yards of the shelter, a backpack was discovered resting beneath a mound of soil and brush. It had not burned during the fire, due to its position near the base of a granite slope. The bag was fully intact with Gary's embroidered EMT patch still bright against the faded fabric. Inside were standard medical supplies, including gauze ointments, a small flashlight, and a thermos still half full. The most peculiar detail was the bag's pristine condition. It appeared untouched by weather or decay. The batteries in the flashlight still worked. Investigators noted that the bag had likely been packed carefully and left deliberately. It was not lost. It was placed, as if someone had intended for it to be found at the right time. The presence of the medical kit also suggested they had expected injury or illness. One officer remarked that the scene did not look like a place someone had escaped from. It looked like a place someone had returned to again and again. The shelter had not been a panic shelter. It had been a home, even if only for a short while. As specialists examined the site, they determined that the shelter had likely been used over multiple seasons. Pine needles had formed layers that indicated repeated visits and careful upkeep. The location was well chosen, difficult to see, even from 20 feet away. Its entrance faced away from all known trails. The soil showed signs of being disturbed, and then compacted again, a tactic often used by survivalists to throw off trackers. The canned goods were neatly arranged in rows, and one corner contained makeshift hooks made from bent nails where coats or packs might have hung. The entire setup had a sense of order and planning, not desperation. It raised more questions than it answered. If the Barlows had been alive long enough to construct this shelter and maintain it, why had they never made contact? Why had they not reached out to law enforcement or returned to Bozeman? The presence of family photographs and the dated journals suggested emotional ties had remained strong. But something had kept them apart from the world. Forensic teams collected samples from the shelter, but no new DNA profiles were found beyond those already linked to the family. No fingerprints other than Gary's were discovered on the medical bag. No signs of other individuals, living or deceased, were located nearby. Still, the detail and care of the structure gave investigators hope that someone might still be alive. The shelter was preserved as evidence and logged into the official case file, along with the journals and contents of the bag. Ruth's sister was brought to the site under supervision. She walked through the narrow interior and stood silently for several minutes. She later told reporters that it felt like stepping into someone's memory, a memory that had stayed perfectly still while everything else kept moving. Her only comment was that Ruth would never have left behind the photograph unless she believed someone would find it. That belief suggested intention, and intention suggested a message. What that message meant remained unclear, but now the investigation had found its first real sign that the family had survived beyond those first vanished days. The discovery of the shelter shifted the direction of the investigation. After years of frustration and blind searching, there was finally physical proof that the Barlows had survived long after they were presumed dead. Local authorities renewed outreach to nearby wilderness communities, forest outposts, and outdoor outfitters hoping someone might have encountered a member of the family and not realized it at the time. A surprising lead came from a wilderness guide named Paul Kessler, who operated near the Salmon River corridor. He recalled an encounter from the summer of 1999 that had never sat quite right with him. During a solo trip, Paul stopped along a bend in the trail to rest, and a young boy emerged from the brush, calm and quiet, as if he had been waiting. The boy wore a flannel shirt several sizes too big and asked Paul for directions to what he called the old burned ridge. Paul had never heard the area described that way. The boy thanked him politely and disappeared into the trees. Years later, after seeing Caleb Barlow's photo online, Paul became convinced that the boy he had spoken to was Caleb. He regretted not reporting the encounter sooner. That same month, another account emerged from a woman named Ellie Zimmerman, who had been hiking along the Devil's Backbone route in the spring of 2003. She described running into a woman in rugged outdoor gear who appeared disoriented but not frightened. The woman had asked Ellie where the nearest ranger station was and seemed to listen very carefully to the response. Ellie offered her food and water, but the woman declined both. She never gave her name and spoke in a slow and careful voice, pausing often as if thinking through each word. Ellie remembered the woman's hands rough and covered in small cuts like someone who had been living outside for an extended period. When Ellie looked away to adjust her pack, the woman was gone. She did not hear footsteps or movement. The woman had simply vanished into the trees. Later, when Ellie came across news of the Barlow case and saw Ruth's photo, she was overwhelmed with certainty. She contacted authorities and gave a detailed statement. Investigators noted the similarities in both sightings. Both individuals had asked about direction and access. Both had disappeared without a trace. The sheriff's department returned to the Devil's Backbone trail with new maps and a revised search plan. This time they brought updated thermal imaging drones, hoping to pick up traces of any recent activity in the area. The forest was dense, but the team identified a small clearing roughly 4 miles from where Ellie had made her encounter. Ground crews reached the location and discovered remnants of a campsite hidden behind a natural rock barrier. A tarp had been strung low to the ground and pinned at the corners with smooth stones. Burn marks in the center suggested a small fire had once been maintained, and in one corner, partially buried in a bed of pine needles, they found a metal tin containing salt, a lighter, and a folded piece of paper with dates written in pencil. Most of the dates were spaced several weeks apart and included markings that read "safe" and "watch." While the writing did not match any official document, it appeared organized and deliberate. The shelter had been left clean. No trash, no tools, no clothing. Whoever stayed there had been careful. The search team expanded their grid, but found nothing more. Parallel to these developments, a former forest maintenance worker named Jesse Mendoza came forward with a recollection from 2001. While performing erosion control along the mountain drainage line that crossed through one of the older fire zones, Jesse claimed he encountered a boy who looked too young to be alone. The boy asked Jesse if he knew how to get back to the old settlement. Jesse had never heard of such a place, but the boy smiled and replied that he would find it himself. Jesse watched the boy walk down the embankment and vanish behind a cluster of trees. At the time, he assumed the boy belonged to one of the hiking families, who sometimes traveled off route. Years later, while watching a documentary about the case, Jesse saw Caleb's photo and immediately recognized him. He described the boy as older than the photos being circulated, suggesting the encounter had occurred after the family was believed to have perished. The description matched the boy from the Salmon River Trail. Both sightings suggested that Caleb had survived well into the early 2000s. Investigators began to compile a timeline of known or credible encounters. The movement suggested a pattern of circular routes across the same region of forest each time, with long intervals in between. It became clear that someone was navigating the terrain with intent, never straying too far, and never returning close enough to civilization to be captured on camera or questioned. The campsite near Devil's Backbone was the most recent confirmed location. Analysts speculated that the person or people involved had learned to avoid detection, had stopped using any traceable items, and had adapted to a nomadic pattern that left no footprint. One ranger remarked that it was not just survival, it was controlled distance. These people had not been lost, they had stayed gone by choice. The hardest part for investigators was accepting that the family might not be waiting to be found. They may have been staying just beyond reach for reasons no one could yet understand. In the early spring of 2010, a county archivist named Daniel Kirsch was tasked with organizing zoning files from the late 1990s, part of an overdue digital catalog project funded by a local grant. The boxes had been untouched for years, stored in a back corner of the Bitterroot County Records Office, where time and dust had blurred the labels. While sorting through faded folders, Daniel came across a thick envelope stuffed between two unrelated documents. It was not marked and had no case number. Inside, he found a single letter, folded carefully into thirds. The paper was yellowed but intact. The handwriting was neat, written in blue ink, and signed at the bottom with the name Ruth. The letter was addressed to someone named Joan and opened with the sentence, "I do not know if this will reach you." It continued for 3 paragraphs, written with the tone of someone both tired and purposeful. Ruth spoke about the weight of decisions about fear, taking root in places where love used to live, and about a boy who had never been given a choice. She wrote he told us this was the only way, and ended with, "I miss you every morning." The discovery of the letter caused immediate waves through the investigation. Ruth's sister Joan was contacted and shown the contents. She confirmed the handwriting and said she had not seen that version of Ruth's writing since the early 90s, when they exchanged birthday cards. The envelope had no return address and had not been mailed. Authorities concluded that someone must have hand-placed the letter during a visit to the records office. The clerk on duty during that period had long since retired, and the logbooks from that year had been partially lost during a basement flood. Forensic analysis revealed trace amounts of soil and pine resin on the envelope similar to materials collected from the hidden shelter near Trapper Peak. The match suggested the letter had been written, or at least handled in the same environment. The writing itself was deeply personal, not a message of desperation, but one of closure. Ruth did not beg to be found. She did not ask for help. She only wanted to be understood. That tone struck investigators as both comforting and deeply haunting. That same month, a Goodwill Center in Helena received a cardboard box labeled miscellaneous gear. It was placed in a donation bin during the night. Staff opened it the next morning and logged the contents. Inside, they found a faded duffel bag containing old trail maps, a melted Motorola pager, and a name badge embroidered with Gary Barlow's initials and EMT credentials. The badge was scorched at the corners, suggesting it had been near a fire, but not consumed by it. The trail maps were decades old and showed fire line patterns and ranger roads from the early 1980s. A store employee noticed that several of the maps had been folded in a way that revealed hidden notes. In the margins of one, someone had drawn lines from the old Trapper Ridge Trail to a location simply marked with a circle and the word "wait." The box also contained a weathered pair of gloves and a cracked compass, both consistent with survival gear used in the 90s. Authorities were contacted immediately. Surveillance footage from the donation center showed a man wearing a hooded sweatshirt dropping off the box just after midnight. His face was never seen. Law enforcement retrieved the contents and examined them in detail. The pager had been registered to the Bozeman Fire Department and had been issued to Gary in 1995. Records confirmed it was deactivated shortly after the family's disappearance. The scorched edges matched the type of fire damage found on tree bark from the Trapper Peak wildfire. This suggested the badge and maps had been preserved somewhere and then transported to Helena intentionally. Investigators believed the man who left the box had some direct connection to the case, possibly even being a member of the family. The timing coinciding with the appearance of Ruth's letter led many to believe someone had made the decision to start releasing clues either as a goodbye or a gesture of acknowledgement. The word "wait" on the map puzzled everyone. It was not a location. It felt more like an instruction, perhaps left for someone who would recognize its meaning. Officers canvassed the area near the donation center, but no one had seen the man or the vehicle he arrived in. In light of the new evidence, detectives compiled everything into a timeline that now spanned over a decade. The movement of items, the scattered sightings, and the careful drop-offs pointed to a consistent hand behind them. Someone had remained close enough to watch, but distant enough to stay hidden. The placement of items suggested a rhythm, a deliberate act of surfacing and retreating. These were not frantic moves. They were planned, methodical, even respectful. Ruth's letter was not just a goodbye. It was a message to her sister, meant to land softly without stirring alarm. Gary's badge was not just gear. It was a signature, left in plain sight, a token of identity from a man who had chosen silence. The timeline ended not with an exclamation, but with a question. If the family had lived for so long in the shadows, why begin leaving breadcrumbs now? The thought unsettled even the most seasoned officers. It meant someone had made peace with being gone, and someone had just decided that the world should know it. In the late fall of 2009, just months after the shelter had been discovered, and the evidence at the Helena Donation Center had been collected, a seasonal trail crew was assigned to repair erosion damage on the southern slopes near the old fire line. This area had not been visited in years and had suffered significant loss during the recent wildfires. The crew worked in pairs, clearing brush, reinforcing drainage ditches, and re-establishing faded boundary markers. On the fourth morning, a worker named Alton Reed was digging near a grove of blackened pine when his shovel struck something soft but uneven beneath the surface. At first he thought it was a bundle of charred roots, but when he cleared away more soil, he saw the edge of a silver emergency blanket peeking through the ash. The blanket had been carefully folded over itself and pinned beneath several stones as though someone had wanted it to stay exactly where it was. The crew called local authorities immediately. When deputies arrived, they began the slow and deliberate process of unearthing what they now believed to be human remains. The soil was damp and smelled of smoke. The air that day held a stillness that made even the birds fall quiet. The remains were found curled in a fetal position, arms wrapped across the chest legs bent slightly, and the entire form wrapped carefully in the emergency blanket. There was no sign of trauma, no visible fractures, no clothing other than a thermal undershirt and worn pants that matched standard outdoor wear from the late 1990s. Nearby, tucked between two tree roots, searchers discovered a tin container that held a plastic identification card, half faded by moisture, but still legible. It bore the name Gary Barlow and listed his blood type and emergency contact information. The container also held a small photograph folded in half. The image was old and grainy, showing Ruth and Caleb standing together in front of a large tree, both of them smiling faintly, with the same exhaustion seen in survival stories, rather than family portraits. Forensic testing confirmed the remains belonged to Gary. No one in the investigative team reacted with shock. Most had already believed he had passed. But finding his body after so long brought the case into a new light. He had died in the forest he had once studied among the trees he had walked through with his son. Gary's death certificate was issued later that year, finally closing a bureaucratic chapter that had remained open for over a decade. But the questions left behind were heavier than the answers. Investigators did not know if Gary had died alone or if someone had stayed with him until the end. The way his body had been buried and wrapped suggested care. It did not resemble a panicked departure or a hasty burial. It looked like a farewell. Someone had taken their time to place his identification, preserve a photo, and shield his body from the elements. Searchers combed the surrounding area for further remains or signs of shelter, but no additional clues were found. Still, the discovery brought a rare clarity to part of the mystery. Gary had not disappeared into nothing. He had stayed in the forest, perhaps by choice, perhaps by circumstance, and someone had laid him to rest with dignity. It was an act of love, not abandonment, and that distinction would carry weight in how the rest of the story was told. In the spring of 2011, a Montana Highway Patrol officer picked up a man walking barefoot along a service road outside Coeur d'Alene. The man was wearing layered clothing several sizes too big and had no identification. He gave a false name, but did not resist when brought to the station for processing. His fingerprints were taken, and within hours a match was returned from the national database. The man was Caleb Barlow, last seen 13 years prior, and believed by many to be dead. He was 27 years old, thin, but not malnourished, and spoke with a quiet reserve that made conversation difficult. When questioned, Caleb did not offer much detail. He refused interviews and declined to answer questions about his whereabouts over the past decade. When shown photographs of his parents, he identified them without hesitation. When asked what happened in the forest, he spoke only one sentence. He said that his mother did not want to leave, and his father did. The officers documented the statement and filed their report. Caleb was not arrested. There were no charges against him. He was given medical treatment and referred to social services. Within weeks, he left the state again. A year later, Ruth's sister received a package in the mail. The box was small and unmarked. Inside was a framed photograph showing a forest glade, sun filtering through the trees with 3 pine stumps arranged in a triangle. The photo was simple, beautiful in its stillness, and held no obvious meaning to anyone outside the family. Tucked behind the frame was a folded piece of paper that held just one sentence. It said, "I still hear her humming sometimes." There was no signature. Joan recognized the handwriting as Caleb's. She placed the frame on her mantel and never told anyone else what she believed it meant. The photo captured something quiet, something that asked for no explanation. It was not closure in the traditional sense, but it was something better than silence. It was a thread left gently on the surface, letting those who remained know that not everything had been lost. The Barlow case was officially closed in the fall of 2012. The final report stated that Gary Barlow had died of unknown causes during a period of wilderness isolation, and that his wife and son had lived off the grid for an undetermined length of time. No evidence of foul play was found. No further sightings of Ruth were ever confirmed. Caleb was last seen in southern Oregon in 2014, using his real name for employment at a small auto repair shop. After that, he vanished from public records. The cabin in the photo was never found. The trail markings faded. The woods reclaimed the shelter. Nature erased what time could not. If this story kept you thinking long after it ended, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more true mysteries told with depth and care. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe really happened to the Barlows, and where are you watching from today?